students, welcome back to my class. Today we are going to study one of the modern poets, W. H. Auden. W. H. Auden, as you know, was a British American poet who is known for his stylistic and technical achievements. And Auden was basically engaged in politics and the moral aspects of life, as well as presenting nature and the nature within and outside man in modern times. So, today's poem from Auden that we have taken is in memory of W.B. Yeats, yet another very important poet of modern times. And W.B. Yeats, as you know, was very intimately involved with the Celtic revival, about the Irish culture, Irish myth, legends, and all that which came in his poetry, as well as his poetry brought the prophecies about the contemporary world, which was ravaged by the world wars, and particularly the Second World War, the most devastating Second World War. And you all know that W.B. Yeats's famous poem, The Second Coming, which prophesied about the cataclysm end of an era. And it almost very correctly prophesied about the destruction that was perpetuated by the Second World War. So, here in this poem, W. H. Auden is trying to make an estimate of W.B. Yeats's influence on his contemporary society as well as the society that followed him after his death. And this poem is divided into three parts. It was written in 1939 when W.B. Yeats died in the very dead of winter in January. And this poem is in an elegiac form, but it is different from the conventional elegy in the sense that here the nature is not exactly mourning the death of the poet, or nature is not being used as an intimate agent in the mourning of the person about whom the poem is written. And it is also a meditative poet on the role and place of poetry in the modern world. The poet taps into the themes of life after death, the power of poetry, and the human conditions. And it is mostly written in an exacting tone with direct language, because we know Auden was a poet who never tried to hide his feelings or his ideals behind the exploitation of words, beside the exhibition of words. And it is a modern poem in its imagery, concept, and versification as well. It depicts a bleak, pessimistic view of the modern world. So, let us look at the poem, which is divided into three parts. In the first part, we find the mourning about the death of the poet in the utter coldness of winter. And the second part is bringing out the generative power behind its poetry. And the third part is trying to make an evaluation of art and poetry and the relationship between poet and poetry and the art and poetry in relation to the society. So, coming to the poem, the first one, the first part, he disappeared in the dead of winter. The brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted, and snow disfigured the public statues. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. What instruments we have agree, the day is of his death was a dark cold day. So it is like an apocalyptic description where in the dead of the winter the poet disappears. The poet is disappearing into the kingdom of death. The brooks were frozen, the airports almost deserted, and the public statues are disfigured with the snow. With the heavy snowfall, even the public statues, they don't resemble the person they are representing. The mercury sank in the mouth of the dying day. Here he is using the metaphor of mouth, which we will find throughout the poem being repeated several times. What instruments we have agree. So all the instruments that were being used by the meteorological department, they agree that the day of his death was a dark, cold day. So in this way, the poet is mourning the death of W.B. Yeats, but there is a difference that he is not mourning by aligning the nature with his feelings or emotions. Rather, the nature is being kept aloof, as if nature is indifferent to the death. Nature is not being sentimentalized. Far from his illness, the wolves ran on through the evergreen forests. The peasant river was untempted by the fashionable quench. By morning tongues, the death of the poet was kept from his poems. And that aloofness of the nature is being sustained in the second stanza when he is telling, far from his illness, the wolves ran on through the evergreen forest. So the wolves have no idea that such a great poet is dying, or if there is any necessity on their part to respond to this death. And the peasant river was untempted by the fashionable quench. The river is also not tempted by morning tongues. The death of the poet was kept from his poems. And when the poet dies, his poems are kept away from him. That means the poems are independent of the poets. The idea of the new criticism that the art is independent of the artist is being reinforced here by W.H. Auden. But for him, it was his last afternoon as himself, an afternoon of nurses and rumors. The provinces of his body revolted. And the poet is coming back to the dying process of W.B. Yeats by narrating about the dying moment. It was afternoon of nurses and rumors. Nurses were running helter and skelter, and the rumors are also equally moving here and there about the condition of W.B. Yeats. And the provinces of his body revolted. Different organs of his body, they were revolting. They were not in company with his body, and gradually they were slipping into the state of being unconscious. The squares of his mind were empty, and his mind was gradually becoming empty. Consciousness was deserting the mind. Silence invaded the suburbs, and in the suburbs, it can suggest both the suburbs of his body, the outer organs of his body, which are being gradually silenced, the activities are being deserted, or the suburbs of Dublin, where the poet was in the deathbed and the suburbs of Dublin was gradually becoming silenced. The current of his feeling failed, and his feelings were failing. He became his admirers. So Auden is almost following the way of W.B. Yeats, describing the prophecy about the second coming, that how things are falling apart, the center cannot hold. So here, the soul of W.B. Yeats, the body of W.B. Yeats, the mind of W.B. Yeats cannot hold. Gradually, they are all falling apart. Now he is scattered among 100 cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections. And after his death, he is scattered among 100 cities. The poet is dead, but his poetry remains. And through his poetry, he is alive in hundreds of cities and wholly given over to unfamiliar affections. And now that the readers are reading his poetry, so the poetry is being interpreted by their affections, which was alien to the affections or feelings of Yeats when he composed them. To find his happiness in another kind of wood. His poetry being interpreted by the different readers in different parts of the world with different cultures, with different experiences of life, where they find his happiness in another kind of wood. So the happy feelings of W.B. Yeats, if there are any in his poetry, they are being interpreted in the strange happiness of people in different parts of the world, and be punished under a foreign code of conscience. And similarly, his poetry is also being interpreted according to the conscience of these people who are strange or strangers to the conscience of the poet. There is no similarity between the conscience of the poet and his readers, and his poetry is being created in newer forms. So here, Auden is trying to give us the idea about the art, its independence from the artist, and the art being consumed by the reader, the reader's response theory, that how the readers are recreating the text by themselves. The words of a dead man are modified in the guts of the living. The words of the dead man, the creation, the poetry, is being modified in the guts of the living. Those people, those critics, those scholars, those readers who are reading his poetry and interpreting in their own way, in their own experiences, their own orientations, are having the guts to interpret differently from that of the poet. But in the importance and noise of tomorrow, when the brokers are roaring like beasts on the floors of the bars, and the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed, and each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom, a few thousand will think of this day. But the next stanza is talking about the indifference of the outer world to the death of the poet. The eminent poet and his death has not affected an iota the outer world. So, the importance and noise of tomorrow, after his death, in future, when the brokers are roaring like the beasts on the floor of the bars, the brokers in the stock exchanges, they're roaring like the beasts. The animal imagery being used by Auden. and the poor have the sufferings to which they are fairly accustomed, and the poor people all over the world, they're accustomed to their poverty. To them, the death of the poet has no significant meaning, has no significant change. And each in the cell of himself is almost convinced of his freedom. And each individual in this world is having his or her own cell where he is convinced of his freedom. Every individual is having a constitution of him which is ever unaltered by anything. A few thousand will think of this day, only a few thousand who know and who value W.B. Yeats as a great poet. They will only think about this day as one thinks of a day when one did something slightly unusual. And on the day of his death, these few thousand of people, followers of W.B. Yeats, for them this day may be unusual, but for all others, this day is as usual. It is the day of any ordinary experience. What instruments we have agree the day of his death was a dark cold day. The repetition about the dark cold day is coming here both as a lamentation and as an ironical statement that the death of the poet is insignificant to the larger public in this world. The artist who has created the art may not create any difference in the mind of the ordinary people in their living experiences. The second part of the poem is a very small part of the poem, and it is only one stanza where the poet is not using his emotions or relationship of intimacy or affection or anything about the dead poet. What generally happens in an elegy. Rather, he is trying to situate W.B. Yeats in a most reasonable manner in the human experience. You were silly like us, your gifts survived it all. The perish of rich omen, physical decay yourself. So he is calling the great poet as silly. You were silly like us. Each of us, we are silly. Why? In spite of our knowledge, in spite of our awareness and conscience, we commit the blunders. We follow certain paths of the life which we think in our conscience or in our knowledge as not to be followed. So the poet is also like a common man. He is a mortal, and he is not only mortal, but he is also a fallible person like any other. Therefore, he is a silly. Your gifts survived it all. You may be an ordinary part of the humanity, but your gifts are extraordinary. It survived all your silliness, all your ordinariness. The perish of rich omen, physical decay yourself, and the perish of the rich omen. In this present world, the rich omen, they are projecting themselves as fashionable, as modern, but what they are doing exactly? It is their physical decay in their artificiality. They are decaying their body and yourself. And in decaying all these things, they are decaying W.B. Yeats's prophecies, warnings about the modern times. Mad Ireland haught you into poetry. Ireland which was mad, Ireland which was revolting against the English occupation, it made you compose the poetry. Now Ireland has her madness and her weather still. So it's you were made after your motherland and its causes, and for its national causes and everything you gave your poetry. But now Ireland has her madness, but Ireland is now again continuing with its madness, and her weather still, its weather is also continuing to be the same. Nobody is affected. The lines are exhibiting that nobody, nothing is being affected by the death of the great poet. For poetry makes nothing happen. This is a very important statement of W.H. Auden by telling that the poetry makes nothing happen. Poetry can never change mankind. Poetry can never change the world. Poetry can never change the mindset of humanity. It survives in the valley of its making, where it executives should never want to tamper. Flows on south from ranches of isolation and the busy grips. Poetry remains where, in which valley it is created. That means, as the poet has created poetry, so the very essence of his thoughts, very essence of his feelings, they remain with him and they die with him. But what remains in the form of poetry, they are being reinterpreted by the society, by different people. But the original emotion and feelings, they die with the poet. And from ranches of isolation and the busy grips, poetry is sometimes considered as different feelings only. They are never considered the different emotions or feelings or passions presented in poetry is never considered in unison, in harmony. Rather, they are considered differently. Raw towns that we believe and die in, it survives a way of happening, a mouth. And the raw town means here the ordinary humanity. The people living in towns ordinarily, we believe and die in. So they believe and die with these emotions, these feelings. It survives a way of happening, a mouth. So if the essence of the spirit of poetry survives anywhere, it survives with the very ordinary humanity. What Wordsworth said, that poetry should pick up the language of the ordinary humanity, because poetry deals with the very common ordinary emotions of common man. So common man only can realize or can reciprocate with that raw emotions and feelings. In the third part, the poet is bringing complication into the relationship between art and artist, poetry and poet. Earth, receive an honored guest. William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie, emptied of its poetry. So the poet is praying to Mother Earth that you receive an honored guest. W. Yeats is a great poet, and with profound reverence, Auden is praying Mother Earth that you receive the honored guest. William Yeats is laid to rest. Let the Irish vessel lie, emptied of its poetry. After his death, the whole of Ireland may be emptied of its poetry, but you receive the poet. You become full with or filled with the honor of Yeats and his poetry. In the nightmare of the dark, all the ducks of Europe bark. But in the second stanza, Auden is talking about that dark page of human life, that is the World War, when The autocrats like Hitler and Mussolini, they were barking. They were compared with dogs. All the dogs of Europe bark and the living nations wait. And all the nations, they are waiting, they are watching what will happen in such a time of difficulty, a time of unprecedented violence, hatred, separation, and everything. Each sequestered in its head. And there is a hatred within each of the states. Every state is in hatred with another in a sequestered manner, and the world is plunged into a state of chaos, a state of destructiveness. Follow, wait, follow right to the bottom of the night. Then in the third stanza, he is talking about following the poet. So, in this state of darkness, in this state of anarchy, in this state of violence, whom should the common people follow? So, he is telling, follow poet, follow right, because poet is different from the politician. The politician claims that he is doing everything for the people, but he gratifies his own selfish ends. The poet, on the other hand, always claims that all these are his feelings, but these feelings are the universal feelings meant for the whole of mankind. So, Auden is telling, follow poet, follow right. If you follow the poet, you will be in the right direction to the bottom of the night, and you will come to the end of the night, because these politicians, these autocrats, they have pushed the world into the darkness. With your unconstraining voice still persuade us to rejoice. O poet, we will follow you. With your unconstraining voice, your voice is never constrained because you are so clear in your intention, in your conscience, in your goal of life. That the goal of life on the part of the poet is to make the world happy, to bring light to the world. Therefore, you are still persuade us to rejoice. So a poet can persuade the whole mankind to rejoice, to go to happiness. With the farming of a verse, make a vineyard of the curse, sing of human unsuccess in a rapture of distress. So what the poet does, the poet farms a verse, through the poetry, make a vineyard of the curse. All the curses of mankind, they are being transformed into a beautiful vineyard. Sing of human unsuccess. Poetry also transforms all the unsuccess, all the failures of humanity into a rapture. Though distressed, but they will come into rapture. They can rejoice in their sorrow. In the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain start. So finally, he is telling, in the deserts of the heart, where the human values are dried up during the Second World War, all the human values, they were massacred. They were left behind. So the poet is imploring, is praying, let the deserts of the heart, let the healing fountain art, let there be healing, let there be the process of bringing back the old values, old feelings to human heart. In the prison of his days, teach the free man how to preach. And finally, Auden is telling, in the prison of his days, when man is chained everywhere because of these people who are selfish and blinded by power, the greed of power, they have put the whole mankind into prisons. They have cornered them. Teach the free man how to praise. But the poet can teach these people how to preach, how to bring the happiness. Here, praise means it is the praise to God, God's creation. and God's creation is man himself. So man can praise himself, and thus man can praise God. So the freedom of life will come through poetry. Happiness will come back through poetry. So this is a poem where we find that death becomes an occasion for Auden to reflect upon the complicated legacy left behind by Yeats, and how the works or the poetry of Yeats had influenced the 20th century landscape. And another significant theme in this poem is the social validity of art and poetry, as he is bringing out the relationship between art and poetry. So, in this way, what we find that this poem is not only condoling the great poet's death, which is unnoticed by men and nature equally, but also Auden is trying to not exactly glorify it, but is trying to glorify poetry and artist through it. And he is also making a comparison between poetry and other things in the world. And he's telling that poetry is the only means which can bring back the glories of man, which can resurrect man to his old state of being. So there are so many metaphors being used here, and the archetypal image cluster at the beginning of the poem with winter and death, and there is a desolate scenario being enacted with winter, and there are also certain negative words being used. But also we have found that the individual metaphors are being used with very cleverness, and uh, if we look at the poem, we find there is considerable ingenuity in employing blank verse, iambic lines, and unequal length of half rhymes, and so on and so forth, because Auden was a master of ingenuity in the stylistic aspect of poetry. So, from this poem, questions we can expect that to evaluate in memory of W.B. Yeats as an elegy. This question can be asked, which already I have discussed that this is not exactly a conventional elegy, but is having a great difference. And also this poem, the question can be uh, asked about this poem is about what are the major themes of this poem. So major themes already I have discussed. It is the theme of presenting poet and poetry, art and artist, and it is mourning the death of W.B. Yeats and relating W.B. Yeats to his contemporary England, Ireland, as well as the whole mankind. I hope that you people will be able to do justice to this poem. Thank you.